Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. I'll talk very briefly about the authors, go into an overview about what the book is, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish up with what I will be reading for next time. David Graeber and David Wengrow. David Wengrow is I believe, a professor and archaeologist at City College London. David Graeber has passed away, sadly, relatively young, but he was an American who roughly 15 years ago moved to England, just because he's considered he was trying to get a position with several U.S. universities. I think he was trying to get tenure at Yale, and they shot him down due to, he claims, I think the story is that his views on mostly anarchy, I think he's a proclaimed anarchist, were deemed too radical. He also is probably best known for writing a book called Debt, which is the history of that kind of idea. So The Dawn of Everything is a lot of stuff. And I'd like to say, first of all, thank you to my friend Jimmy for providing this book to me for the review. So for good or for bad, he is responsible for this. But The Dawn of Everything is a lot of stuff. I think it is Graeber and Wengrow try to put together an idea of how do we go back and find when humanity went astray in terms of inequality. And just to give you the background, Graeber is a professor of anthropology, so he is trained as an anthropologist. Wengrow is an archaeologist, and so this is really their 10-year look at many, many different things, but mostly it's the idea of how do we go back and try to find the dawn of everything being the dawn of inequality among peoples, in terms of hierarchical structures, in terms of a governmental apparatus being able to force people to do things they don't want to do. And so when they kind of start this, they start looking at the differences between the general view of peoples before, quote unquote, written history or civilization began, the Hobbesian view versus the Rousseauian view of just, were people before agriculture, did they typically tend to get along with each other and live in kind of this pre-pastoral era before, Western civilization came in, and before agriculture came in and kind of forced people to accept private property and then kind of accept these differences among each other. They kind of led to these social hierarchies. Or was it a Hobbesian view where people were constantly fighting with each other over everything all the time, man against man? And they pretty early on kind of reject both those views and say, the truth is in the middle. And they look at several different instances in history of various social structures that people have put forward, both pre-agriculturally or post-agriculturally, in order to basically point out the fact that the idea that everyone organized themselves in any kind of manner of monarch or any kind of manner of republic or any kind of manner of representative democracy, they basically reject that. Again, Graeber is an anarchist, and so he's pointing out these examples where people in these communities they chose not to form their societies that way. There's this idea that they bring up that I think was really interesting that I wasn't aware of, called simogenius, which is this idea that people in groups inherently will take on characteristics that are against similar other groups. And so they point to in California, pre-Columbus, there were various Native American tribes, and they all structured their societies, as it were, slightly differently. So some societies had slavery, and some societies purposely did not have slavery. And he also brings in the idea of Athens and Sparta and how that's a historical example of two societies that were very, very geographically close, but could not have been more different as far as the way that they formed. And so there's a lot of those things that I thought was really interesting. I think the idea that to me was most interesting in it, along with the sismogenius, which I'm sure I have butchered, is the idea of them kind of taking an axe to the idea that there is a step ladder, as it were, from tribal bands to cities to nation states, and these kind of all are stepping stones upon each other. And they take a kind of a club to that and show at various points people who were able to form their own societies have rejected those things and rejected those stepping stones. And they give a lot of examples of various, most of what they're looking at are pre-Columbian, as it were, tribes in what we call America. He also looks at Ukraine as an example of where people by the Black Sea formed something akin to like a proto-anarchic society, where there was essentially a circle of mutual aid where people were relying on each other for various things. So there's a lot to the book. There is a lot to the book. And like everything, there's some things that I agreed with, and there were some things that I was kind of taken aback with. The way that they look at agriculture, to me, I found confusing, because again, kind of the typical story of agriculture is once agriculture arrives, you then have private property, because you have to have people who are in charge of land in order to make it function. You have what they call the death of the commons, and the idea of the any non-private space people will take advantage of, and by privatizing it, you have more production, you have more people tending the land, and all those things. And they basically say, well, that's not necessarily 100% true, not even most of the time, and they give examples where that is the case. Some things that I found a little bit more confusing is they have this real long section on play farming, and kind of the nuanced difference between when a society or when a group is play farming versus when they are really farming was kind of confusing to me. How do you measure what is the tipping point past where you're play farming or where you're actually farming? They point out that in kind of pre-Columbian Native American tribes, they oftentimes would have seasonal social orders. So they would have a winter season, which was maybe the hunting season if they were hunting seals and whatever. They had a separate social order. They had a equinox, or they had some kind of festival, or they had some kind of break, and then they would completely change their social order when they were not hunting and where they were essentially in one place, either farming or gathering local whatever. So I thought that was a really interesting idea, not something I really thought about very often. So that was a cool concept. The other thing they don't really touch on so much is the so they have a long section of the Algonquin Iroquois tribes in the general northeastern United States around essentially the 15, 16, 1700s, and they talk about kind of the critique mostly of the French society, but also just in general European societies. And they have a whole thing where they spend all this time talking about how it's probable that a lot of those ideas made their way into the salons of France and Germany and England, and really influenced the changing social orders of the day. So when you have things like the American Revolution or the French Revolution, those, if you go backwards, a lot of those ideas came from, as critiques, from Native Americans in this country. They spent a lot of time on it. It's one of those things that will never be proven one way or another. Like, was it 5%? Was it 10%? It's just like, it's such a strange thing to me that they seem to get caught up on, where it's like, even if I accept your idea, you seem to be beating this into the book for a reason I didn't quite understand. They don't really talk about the population size differences, which to me maybe have been one of the reasons that maybe Native American tribes were dismissed, because it's like I tried to do some research to see what was the analogous population sizes of, say, the various tribes in the northeastern United States versus like Paris, France. And it was like, as best as I could tell, around roughly the same amount of time, 1700, say, it was like 250,000 people in the northeastern United States in various tribes, and there was like 500,000 people in Paris. And the geographic area of those two things is like, basically, if you look at I'm not sure if it's the Algonquin Nation or the Iroquois Nation, so I apologize if I get that wrong, but it's essentially geographically the size of like 2 Pennsylvanias. So these populations were extremely low density populations, and so I think that's maybe part of the reason for the dismissiveness. They also talk about Manoa, and apparently Manoa was the center of women had much more formal power than in a lot of other places, and they talk a lot about how over time women's power was not really recognized, and there are many, many, many matriarchal societies where this was the case. Again, it was one of those things where I didn't quite follow what the through line of that was. They seemed to make assumptions and say things like, well, women were really the ones who did all these things farming, and they did all these things where they manipulated nature, but it wasn't really farming, it was just play farming. And just again, that the tipping point for where you go into play farming and when you're not, and how you know it was women and not men, it was just, it seemed like these things were based more on assumptions than really felt like logical, sound arguments. They do cite a ton of stuff, and I'm sure if I went into the citations, I could have pulled up those things and read those things. They cite probably 100 works. And so if you really want to do the work and check this, if this is a topic that you're interested in, this is a book that I think will serve you well in that sense. So I thought that was really interesting. And then in the end, the only other thing I can think of, I'm just trying to read some of my notes here. The writing and stuff is another, probably the last critique I had. Well, two critiques. The author's kind of the sense of humor. They kind of insert themselves and have kind of cheeky senses of humor sometimes I didn't really care for. And they also, there's felt like a lot of jumping around from idea to idea, and sometimes it was very difficult to follow. If you don't have really a relatively strong foundation of a lot of pre-European peoples, both in South America, North America, a little sprinkling of Africa. They don't spend a ton of time in Africa other than the kind of the Egyptian, ancient Egypt and that. If you don't really have a background in any of that, it felt like a lot all the time. And so that was a little hard sometimes to follow. But overall, I thought the ideas in it were interesting and worth checking out. In the end, what they try to do is, again, try to show this idea of, if you were trying to tear down this idea of trying to find the origins of inequality, because their argument, I think, is basically, there are different kinds of inequalities everywhere, and so what inequality you're talking about. They kind of come up with this idea that you should have the ability to go wherever you want to when you want to, the ability to disorder or not follow orders, and I think there was a third one that I can't recall off the top of my head, but they basically apply that framework and try to say, where did kind of this idea and how did this idea come around where that was kind of broken. And I think that I don't think explicitly say this. This video is running a little long, I apologize, but it's a lot of book. They don't explicitly say this, I think, in the book, but I think they tend to believe that it happened in different places for a different reason, but at some point, due to the certain cultures taking on different ways to honor or praise the gods or the spirits, a lot of times will be done through food. So they look at South America. I don't remember if it was the Inca, may have been the Inca, but their idea is essentially, for you to praise the various gods, you have to have a grain-based alcohol, and for you to have a grain-based alcohol, you have to be able to acquire a certain amount of grain to praise your ancestors and the spirits and things of that nature. And so that kind of started a debt cycle there for a lot of people who weren't able to do that themselves. And so that's one of the ideas too. So there's just a lot of ideas. It is a very thick book. It goes on. But I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there if that's something that you like thinking about, where did inequality come from and how were people before, European civilizations, how were they formed as far as the societies and what did they believe in? And the answer is that he points out is they basically believed in everything. And he points out, you can have a monarch-like government, but you cannot have agriculture. And he points to the Calusa, which is a tribe in Florida, where the European settlers, upon coming to them, saw that they were basically built around this kind of very strong, very violent leader, but they also were essentially fishermen or hunter-gatherers, and so they didn't have that lined up with the agriculture. So it was interesting in just kind of seeing those kind of ideas broken a little bit, or at least twisted, and you're like, why is that the way that it is? So if that at all is something that interests you, The Dawn of Everything, I would not start with The Dawn of Everything. They do reference to a lot of other books. Guns, Germs, and Steel gets brought up a couple times. They bring up Sapiens, which I have reviewed. I'll put the link below. They bring up some other stuff. If you've read other Graeber, I'm sure that would help you. Again, if you understand certain tenets of anarchy, you'll see that throughout the book, and his ideas and how they apply to again, mostly Native American tribes, and the differences in the way that they, for instance, both the Europeans will torture and kill people to death around the same time as the Native American tribes, but they do it for very different reasons, and he draws kind of a moral conclusion from that. So I'll leave it there, I guess. But if you're interested in things like that, like *Sapiens* or *Guns, Germs, and Steel*, or anything by Steven Pinker or by Richard Dawkins, if you're interested in any of that stuff, I think you'd really enjoy *The Dawn of Everything*. Until what I'll be reading for next time is *Little Fires Everywhere*, completely different, but we're going to go for it. Thank you for watching this. If you enjoyed this, please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you have read *The Dawn of Everything*, I would actually be interested to hear other people's thoughts on it. My main criticism with it felt like just a lot of ideas kind of coming at you all at once, and I felt like sometimes it could have been tighter and could have flowed logically a little bit more, but it felt like sometimes we were jumping around from idea to idea. And I think you do have to have a base of knowledge to really understand a lot of it before you're like overwhelmed. But that was my take on it. Be interested to hear what yours is. Till next time, bye.